Hello, my love. Welcome to another episode of Blisstopia podcast. I am your host, Mercedes Castellani, and I am so happy to be recording this episode today. We're going to have a super interesting conversation today. Our guest is Steph Diplock. Steph is a mindful, high-performance coach who blends ancient wisdom with modern neuroscience to empower high performers, entrepreneurs, and ambitious professionals to heal, grow, and reach their full potential. She's a recovered perfectionist, certified spiritual life coach, yoga teacher, breathwork facilitator, veterinarian, and a long life learner. So, welcome, Steph, to the show. I am super excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mercedes. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Amazing. So today we're going to talk about some of the obstacles that we can face every time that we set a goal or an intention in our lives. These, little creatures that come into our world, like perfectionism or self-sabotage or procrastination. So every time we set a goal, we have a dream, we have an intention that we want to, achieve in our lives. These little monsters creep into our lives. So we're going to be today, I think, understanding these little monsters, why they're here, what they actually want to teach us, and how we can actually stop them from actually preventing us to actually reach our goals and to be able to reach those goals in a more easy manner, in a more friendly manner. So why don't we start by the very beginning? Can you tell us a little bit more about your story and why did you decide to become a high performance coach?
Absolutely. And this is always the hardest question I find, isn't it? Because when you do start to do this work, there's usually a very squiggly line that has got you to there. It's not usually a very linear path. When you choose this as something that you want to focus your attention, really direct your purpose towards, it can be, a bit of a mixed bag on the way there. For me, it makes sense to start as my early sort of to teenage years. I decided that I wanted to become a veterinarian. And to be a vet at that time, especially, it was like one of the most challenging things you could do. You really used it. Obviously, this was quite unconscious at this age, but I used this as a way to prove myself. I used it as a way to be like, okay, well, if I can get into vet school and then I can be a vet, then I'm going to feel good enough. Yes, I did have, and I still do have, this genuine love for animals, this thirst for knowledge, this desire to understand things. But I know that a big part of my own journey was this sense of needing to prove myself as good enough. And it wasn't until I was reaching all of these goals, and this is a story that I'm sure so many of your listeners will have their own version of. You reach these goals and it's like, well, okay, well, am I supposed to be happy now? And then what you do is you just move the goalposts further and further. And it doesn't feel like you're going to, like you expect it to. And then that creates this inner critic that's probably been there all along, but it gets noisier and noisier. And you keep working harder and harder, but not necessarily feeling that satisfaction. There's still this idea that I need to be better. I need to do better. So a few things happened along the way that I won't dive into the whole story, but there was a very pivotal moment for me in 2020 where I was very much on the brink of burnout. I had a few things outside of veterinary. I was a runner. I did yoga. I had these things for myself, but I was really burning the candle at both ends. And there was a moment in the middle of 2020, and obviously there was a lot going on in 2020 globally, but I actually got kicked in the face by a horse at work. And it was very much a moment of, you can't keep doing this. This is the warning we're giving you. It felt very much like a clear message. And they say the universe gives you a little nudge, and it might give you a little shove, and then it might, kick you in the face.
Getting goosebumps, this is your warning sign.
Absolutely. And if I look back, I could see there were a few other warning signs that I had perhaps ignored. And this was my wake up of, okay, we need to do things differently. That tumbled into a cascade of self-discovery. I did my yoga teacher training. I changed jobs. I just really went on this path of, okay, I don't have to do things the way I thought I needed to. And so now the reason that I call myself a mindful high performance coach is because what I'm really passionate about is really empowering people to see that they can do things differently. Like you can achieve your goals, but in a way that actually makes you feel good. Because sometimes I think it's easy to go to either extreme. You get this like hustle and grind culture where you're like pushing yourself to the limits and, maybe getting good external results. But on the inside, it feels suffocating. It's like a golden cage you build around yourself. And then sometimes on the other end, there's almost this idea of, well, I can't push myself too hard because I'm scared of burning out, or I'm scared that it's going to happen again. I'm scared that I'm going to go too far. So I'm really about marrying that like balance between this drive and this mindfulness. And that's where, that's where the term mindful high performance coach has come for me.
I love this. I love your story. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think we have, so many things to learn from this. And this is actually one question that I see and that I've wondered many times in my life. There's this paradox between, okay, how can I set really high standards for myself, and goals? Because sometimes we know we can be a bit of an overachiever. So how can we set ourselves goals and do these things, but at the same time, we want to be peaceful. We want to be non-attached to the outcome. I mean, non-attached meaning that we could be good either way. But when you're an overachiever, that's like, no, I want it to happen. It needs to happen. So how can a high achiever, achieve, continue to grow in life, but then at the same time remain mindful and remain peaceful in the process? How do you find that balance between those two things that can seem a bit of an opposite sometimes?
Absolutely. It can seem like an opposite. And I think it's also very important to notice that it's not actually going to be simple, because sometimes you're going to take it maybe a little bit too far. Sometimes you're going to go the other way. And it's actually more like a dance. And it's letting go of the idea that you're going to have it perfect. Because when you are really passionate about something, it can be really challenging to rein that in if you do have that like unbridled passion. But something that I heard actually on another podcast on the Diary of a CEO, which I'm sure many people have listened to, but something that Stephen always talks about is this idea of being driven or dragged. And I think this actually sums this up, because if you're being driven by something, you're being driven by like, it's this pull, it's this feeling within you that this is my purpose. This is something that I really, want to achieve. And you can see how it fits in. Or if you feel like you're running away from something, you're being dragged by something, you're being in this energy of like proving yourself. So I think it takes a lot of introspection and self-awareness. It takes stillness to actually sit back and be like, okay, for me, truly, if I listen to myself, and I know you speak a lot about intuition, and it's like, if I speak to myself and I ask myself that question, like, what is driving me? Or am I being dragged? And when it comes to setting goals, one of the things that overachievers and perfectionists often don't do is they don't allow themselves to even celebrate when they've reached those goals. And that can be a sign that you are stepping into that category, that territory of hustle and overachieving, because you're not even pausing to be like, look how far I've come. Like you can, list off everything that you did wrong or didn't get done that day. But if someone was to ask you, well, what went well? Like, what are you proud of? Maybe you dismiss it. Maybe you just say, oh, I just got lucky, or so-and-so did that, or that wasn't enough anyway. So it's looking at whether you focus more on your failures or focus more on what you achieve and how you speak to yourself, which takes a lot of practice, because often this inner critic is running the show, and it has for so long that you don't even notice half of the horrible things that you say to yourself. And I think mindful high performance really comes down to how you speak to yourself and how you let yourself celebrate.
Yes. Things that sometimes we can be our worst critic, our worst judge. We would say things to ourselves that you would never say to a best friend. You would never say to your partner. but we say to ourselves, oh, that wasn't good enough. Oh, who do you think you are? It can be really, really mean. And I think we need to learn to tame that critic, tame that critic down, and to have more of an inner cheerleader inside of us, and to try to, as much as possible, as you said, celebrate the wins and the things that did work and the things that we did do right. And they are probably many, many, many things when you actually pay attention to them. So this is very, very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about perfectionism, which I know it's very important in your story, and it's a topic that you are really fond of. So I'm interested to know, why does a person become a perfectionist, and how, when they spot these things, how can they, how can they spot them, and how can they start changing? Because I don't think you can tell a perfectionist, okay, from now on, you will do things less than perfect. You're going to do, before it was a 10, now you're going to just settle with a 6. I don't think that will do the trick for a perfectionist. So let's start by the beginning. Why does a person become a perfectionist? How can we spot it? And then what can we do about it?
I love this question. And it's so interesting because many perfectionists, or people who have a perfectionist part, I should say, like I like to really refer to it, even though I refer to myself, as a recovering perfectionist for simplicity. It's like, this is only a part of you. This is not who you are. This is a protective part of you that has developed for a reason. But people who have this perfectionist part, early on, when they're starting to recognize this, often won't necessarily call it what it is. They won't even see it as that, because I hear all the time from people when we're discussing this that they have this light bulb moment of, oh, well, I didn't think I could be a perfectionist because I wasn't good enough. It's like it's like already you hear it and you're like you can see it happen. I've seen this happen with so many clients because they're like, I don't really think I'm a perfectionist because like I never really did that well. And you actually get down to it and you're like, well, what would have been good enough? And there's nothing. So it's like, well, okay, well, you've kind of answered your own question. But to go back to how this develops, I think it's very complex. Like there's definitely certain innate personality traits that will lean towards this. But a lot of it is basically learned as a way to attempt to control how others perceive you, which sounds a little bit sinister in a way, but it's not. It's a form of self-protection. It's an attempt at minimizing feelings of discomfort, feelings of shame, that minimizing that core wound of unworthiness, of not feeling good enough. And it may develop the sort of typical way people think of it developing is if you do have a caregiver who is, overtly critical, maybe a teacher, someone who is a lot of influence, but it can be a lot less clear than that. It can be that you witness this in other people. Like you witness, maybe your dad wasn't hard on you, but he was really hard on himself. And you start to learn, okay, well, this is how I, should speak to myself. This is what I should do. So it's not a case of, it has to be these really strict parents, or it has to be, this idea that you were, punished for getting anything less than an A+. And the interesting thing about perfectionism that makes it so challenging for people to recognize is that it's a coping mechanism that's actually rewarded. Like you actually get a lot of praise for this, this high achieving, this always trying to do better. Even when you think of, and I was guilty of this for sure, like I never saw it as a bad thing. And I remember we were doing like mock interviews at school, and they'll be like, what is your worst trait, or what's something that you need to improve on? And people used to say, well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, because they thought it was like a good flaw to have, because you're like, well, if I say I'm a perfectionist, then that's great, because then they know that I've got really good attention to detail and that I've got high standards. And yes, those are really admirable qualities. Absolutely. Like who wouldn't want high standards? Who wouldn't want attention to detail? But the paralyzing thing about perfectionism is it actually stops you from achieving your potential, because it makes you too scared to start things. Most perfectionists, or people with a strong perfectionist part, they will actually procrastinate more, because the ultimate way of protecting yourself from failure is to never even start in the first place. It's far easier to agonize over which fonts to use on Canva for 2 hours and rebrand your logo 27 times than to actually put something out there and have the world see it and maybe criticize it. And it keeps you busy. It keeps you busy. It keeps you in this planning phase, but then you never have anything to show for what you're actually, like all the effort that you've put in. Perfectionists have a very noisy inner critic, as we spoke about. It's this constant companion, this constant, you need to do better. But most people with a strong perfectionist part wouldn't even know what that looks like. Like you ask them to say, well, when would you feel like it's enough? And there isn't an answer. So it's something that is misunderstood. It's something that is a protective mechanism. It's a learnt behavior to protect yourself from feelings ultimately of shame. This is a lot of what Brene Brown's work goes into as well. And it's really, yes, it's just a means of control.
And I think it's very interesting what you say, because sometimes this can be rewarded. This perfectionism is what gets you through your studies. It's what gets you, up in the corporate ladder. So it's then difficult to see, okay, all my success and all my achievements, they've been based on this. And now I'm supposed to let go of this. It's like maybe your whole life trajectory has been based on this. So it might be hard for a perfectionist to let go of that part that has been so fundamental, because it's not like saying, okay, you smoke and it's a bad thing, and eventually you want to quit if a person is a smoker. So it's a bad thing, but then with the perfectionism, it got you so many good things in life, but at the same time it's making you suffer, and you're just not aware of that. So it's difficult because it's been a positive thing, a positive part of your life. So then it's hard to let go. And then who are you without that part of your life,
Yes, and it's such a spectrum, because it's not like you're not letting go of your high achieving nature and your drive. Like I am still a very ambitious person. I am a person who likes to be doing lots of things. Like rest is not my default state. I have to actively force myself to do that. Like it has taken a lot of practice. Like even today, like I spent like 3 hours reading a fiction book, just absolutely lost in this beautiful story. And at university, or even after university, like I would have seen that as like a waste of time. Like it wasn't productive enough. Or if I was resting, it would be this case of, how can I make this rest more productive? And it's not like you're not letting go of this high achieving nature. And it's actually showing people that they are like their success is not because of their perfectionism. Like they are successful in spite of their perfectionism. Because perfectionism is just when it tips over into that sort of self-critical, like paralysis. Like it's not actually the high achieving. It's like when it goes over too far, like the pendulum swung like too far that way. And so you don't have to let go of your high performance, but it's really about like, how do you want to feel when you actually are going towards these goals? Like, do you want to feel like you're constantly looking over your shoulder, like someone's going to find out that you're not good enough? Do you want to feel like it's like nothing's ever enough? It's actually like finding the freedom. It's almost in a way, there's a sense of like thanking that part of you for what it has done. Like it has adapted to the environment it was in. It has done its best to keep you safe, but it's this, I don't need you to do this anymore. Like we can move forward. Like we can actually have far more success if we allow ourselves to fail, if we allow ourselves to learn as we go. It's that, that age old saying, it's like the master has failed more times than the student has ever tried, because there's so much to learn from those 99%, those 75%, those 32%. Like it doesn't have to be 100%. Yeah. So it can be hard to let go, but it's seeing it as separate from your high achieving.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because then, okay, you get to keep the things that have, pushed you in life and that have given you some of that success, etc. But it's maybe doing it in a different way, a more human way, a more compassionate way. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time. It doesn't have to be pretty all the time. you can take messy action, and that's okay. And then learn and evolve and do it again and learn from that experience. That's so beautiful. And then I think when we set goals or we have dreams in life, we can also have other little monsters coming. So perfectionism is one of them. But then we can also have self-sabotage or even procrastination. So how do we recognize when we are self-sabotaging ourselves, when we are boycotting ourselves, and how do we deal with that?
There's two main ways that you can recognize this. The first is, like, you hear people say this all the time, like, I just couldn't make myself do this. Like, it's this idea of like, even the term self-sabotage, like, there's a part of you that's holding another part of you back or holding the whole of you back. And people say, oh, I get in my own way, or I don't know why I did that, or I don't know why I just can't make myself do it. Like, it's this conscious awareness that you're not doing the thing that you say that you want to do.
Mm.
And there's sometimes another more unconscious, more subtle form of self-sabotage, where you just find that every time you're about to reach your goal, something goes wrong. You might find that every time you're in a happy relationship, for example, there's just, as soon as things get good, you start arguing. You start picking petty fights and you don't know where they came from. It might be things like you are due to be getting like a promotion at work, and then you oversleep and you never usually do that, and you miss a meeting and things. It's like these things just keep happening. So it's looking at patterns. It's like, okay, this is where I say that I want to be, but I'm not there yet. And it's getting really curious with that. It's not doing this from a place of shame. So the first part of this is really recognizing that this is not, even though what it sounds like is that it's you against you, it's not like an evil saboteur that's trying to manipulate you and ruin your life. This is another part of you, similar to that perfectionist part potentially, that is actually trying to protect you from something. Like self-sabotage at its core, most of the time, is a form of self-protection. And most of that time it's because there is something on the other side of that behavior that you want to do, or that goal that you want to reach. There's something on the other side of that you have not recognized, something that you are actually afraid of in some way. And it may be a change that on paper sounds good. So it's easier to like problem solve this, I guess, with a real life example. Like, say, for example, someone is trying to bring in more wealth in their life. They want to bring in more clients in their business, and they are, doing all the work. They're hustling, they're doing everything. But for some reason, every time someone's about to sign, something happens. They just keep ending up in this cycle of exactly where they started, like paycheck to paycheck, never quite there. When you start to look at their goals, say, for example, for this person, you might ask them, you were like, well, what do you want? And they might say more wealth, more clients, more this. And then when you start to say, like, well, what would be the worst thing that would happen? And they're like, well, there's nothing bad that would happen. This is just great. And then you dive deeper and it's like, well, actually, I am worried that if I have more clients, like, I might not be able to support them. I'm already really busy. I already feel so busy. And then they say it again. They're like, I'm already so busy. And it's like, well, there's actually an unconscious part of you that is sabotaging this new wealth, these new clients, because you're afraid of the work, the responsibility, that you're not going to have enough time. So self-sabotage is, and again, that's a process that takes a while to get to. That's overly simplified, but self-sabotage is not an evil saboteur pulling strings. It is a form of self-protection. It is that your nervous system feels a threat and you are protecting yourself from that. So perfectionism is a form of self-sabotage in many ways, because you're trying to avoid the discomfort of not feeling good enough. You're burning yourself out. You're working towards this goal, but it's never enough.
And I think it's really interesting. The way I see also the role of a coach is that sometimes I think all of the clients that come to me, for example, they have a goal, they have a dream, and they have tried everything, but it's like they're getting in the way of themselves. They want to do this thing, but they're getting in the way. There's some belief, there's some story, there's some form of self-sabotage that it's not allowing them to move forward. If that wasn't there, if that self-sabotage wasn't there, they wouldn't need a coach. They would just go and do the thing that they want to do. But they've tried and they are getting in the way of themselves. What they want to do with the coach is actually, okay, help me recognize what's happening and help me get rid of this so that actually I can do what I want to do, because I have the energy, I have the motivation, but I'm getting in my own way. So that's part of the role that a coach can take, is to help you get rid of that things that are not serving you.
Absolutely. And your conscious mind will protect you from that uncomfortable part of you that has those hidden motivations, those unconscious motivations, because your unconscious mind is 95% of your reality, but it's not, like, by its very definition, it's unconscious. So it's under the surface. So you often need another perspective, someone to ask something in a slightly different way to bring that out of you. And I think we all self-sabotage on some level, because it's a very natural human thing to do, because it's around your nervous system just wants to keep you alive. And to keep you alive, to keep you safe, it keeps you in the familiar. So anytime that you're taking a big up level or you're making a big change in your life, even if you consciously want it, your nervous system will perceive that as a threat, and it will do whatever it can to get back into homeostasis, to get back into that familiar, because it is always going to be rerouting you to what is known. So it's important to really do this work with someone who can support you and not go into a shame spiral about this and be like, well, I'm just wrong, I'm just broken, this isn't meant for me, because your nervous system is just doing what it knows to do. And it can take time to actually progressively expand your capacity for that discomfort, for the change, to actually get comfortable being uncomfortable and start to build those neural pathways in your brain, start to actually create that neuroplasticity where you become that new version of yourself.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. And what about procrastination? Why do we procrastinate? I imagine it's also a form of self-sabotage, but what happens particularly in procrastination? Because it's not like we just want to wait and wait and wait, and then we have the deadline. There's a bit of pressure that kicks in, and then we want to do it. But what is actually happening? What's the mechanism behind procrastination?
Procrastination is such an interesting one as well. I actually love talking about procrastination. And the first myth that I want to dispel is that procrastination is not some evil thing. And it's probably not something that you're ever going to get rid of completely. They've been talking about procrastination. There are quotes from Aristotle thousands of years ago. They're talking about procrastination. And they didn't have smartphones or TikTok.
They're not finished yet. Quotes are not finished. We're still procrastinating.
Yeah. I was like, this is, it's not something that ever fully goes away. So we want to first dissolve the shame around that. And the first thing as well is that with any behavior, it's looking at is it helpful or is it harmful? Because there is a small proportion of people who actually do thrive on that little bit of extra pressure. There's times where you can have purposeful procrastination, where if you know that you actually work a little bit better, and there's nuances here, because sometimes that's a little bit just relying on the stress. But there are a lot of people who actually, they need a bit more structure, they need a bit more of a deadline to do their best work. So firstly, we don't have to fix something that's not broken. So actually asking yourself, okay, is this something that's actually helping me or harming me? And if you say, okay, well, look, it is harming me. I didn't need to spend 3 hours scrolling on my phone when I had this assignment due or this project I was meant to be finishing. When we look at self-sabotage and procrastination in particular, procrastination is not about avoiding the thing that you're doing. It's avoiding the feelings that the thing that you need to do is going to bring up. So it's getting really honest with, what are those feelings? And it can be something as simple as boredom, like that you don't want to do this task. Like it's not aligned with who you want to be. It's something that genuinely is boring. And, potentially if it's boring, but you need to do it, there's an element of discipline there that we have to learn. Like there's no two ways around that. If it's boring because it's not in alignment with what you want to do, then that's a whole bigger conversation to maybe start looking at that a bit deeper. But so often it's things like the fear of failure. It's like, well, I'm procrastinating it because I don't want to get this wrong. Like, I don't want to finish this. Again, this is the perfectionism. It's this, okay, if I actually start on this, I'm going to open myself up to judgment and criticism. And that's scary. It might be the fear of success, which is, again, far sneakier than its friend, the fear of failure. And that comes right into that self-sabotage conversation of what is on the other side of the success that feels so uncomfortable. So it's looking at what the feeling is that's making you avoid what you are doing, because it's very rarely about the actual specific task itself. There is an element of habits as well, like procrastination becomes a habit. Like we become good at what we do repeatedly. So if you are someone who chronically procrastinates, like we are training our brain that we don't do what we say we're going to do. It's eroding that self-trust. So that's something that we need to rebuild as well. But it's also looking at the underlying reasons of what is that feeling that task is bringing up.
Yes. And I think this really hits home, when you talked about procrastinating because you're not aligned, because it's not aligned with your purpose. I remember when I was still in my corporate job, I would procrastinate a lot, pretty much all the time, and wait until the deadlines. Then in the end, the result was good because I was also a bit of a perfectionist. So in the end, the result would be good, but I would procrastinate and be dragged all the time. And then I switched, I completely switched my professional life. I created my own company. I'm fully aligned with my purpose. I'm super motivated with the things that I do. And I find out that I don't procrastinate because I want to see these things happening. And I'm like, why am I going to procrastinate? I want to see it now. Like I want it to happen now. I'm more like come on, it's not moving fast enough, So it's really interesting. And I think, as you said, it's really important to look into the feeling. Why are we procrastinating? And if there's a major reason why we're procrastinating, because maybe you just don't like that job anymore, or maybe you just don't like that person anymore. So you're procrastinating, maybe being more engaged with this person or moving forward in the relationship with that person because you're not fully aligned with that relationship. So I think procrastination can be quite if we really analyze it, a really nice wake up call to say, okay, you actually need to implement some changes in your life. It might be some major changes that need to be happening so that you can actually enjoy your work, enjoy your relationships, etc.
Absolutely. And it's a question that a lot of people don't allow themselves to even ask, do they? They just think, oh, well, I'm just lazy, I'm just unmotivated. That inner critic just says all these things, but actually, there could be something. There is something. I know there's something for you that will actually light you up. And it doesn't mean that you're thrilled with every single task that you're doing every day when you're living your purpose. But I do believe exactly what you said is like, if you are chronically procrastinating with something and there's this feeling within you that this is not quite it, like that is your invitation to explore.
Yes, something is happening in there. And then there's a very interesting concept that it's called upper limits. So when we want to, create something new in our lives, whether that's more wealth or a different job or different kind of relationship, we can have these upper limits coming up. Can you explain a little bit more what that is? Because I think maybe perfectionism, procrastination, self-sabotage, we hear a lot, in like everyday life, but what is actually upper limits and how can we spot them in our thoughts? Because I have the impression that these guys are going to be really sneaky. They're going to be there hitting in some beliefs maybe. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
So this is a concept that is spoken about in Gay Hendricks' book, The Big Leap. And it really does relate to what we've been speaking about in terms of self-sabotage, because the upper limit is basically the unconscious limitation that you place on yourself to have a certain level of ultimately happiness. It might be wealth, it might be, love, it might be family, like it might be something more specific, but ultimately it's like, how much joy will you like allow yourself to have? And this can show up for people if you have, definitely if you've grown up with trauma, which, so many people have grown up with trauma. If you haven't necessarily had, sort of the ideal home environment modeled to you, you create this idea of like what your life is like allowed to be. And even if consciously, so logically, like you say, I want this, like I want more. But if your unconscious mind is still stuck at the upper limit of like, no, it's not safe to have this. It ultimately comes down to safety and what your nervous system will allow. Because remember, this is all self-protection. It's like, no, we can't have that. Like, we can't have that wealth. If we have that wealth, then people won't like us. I've always heard, those classic lines of people say, money is the root of all evil, more money, more problems. Like if you have an unconscious belief that more wealth is going to bring you more problems, then of course you're going to protect yourself by not allowing yourself to acquire more wealth. If you have grown up with a volatile, like caregivers relationship, like you've seen people fight, you've seen, awful things, and you're like, well, okay, well, I'm not going to allow myself, to have a loving relationship because everybody leaves. There might be that unconscious belief there. So it comes down to, what you will allow yourself to tolerate, because when it comes to healing from trauma, like a lot of the time, it's not about, training yourself or learning to tolerate hardships. It's actually about relearning how to allow yourself to tolerate joy.
That's really nice. Really nice. And I think we have to, when we talk a lot about the unconscious mind and the things that we will allow ourselves, and it's like we need to, all of this is stored in our bodies. So it's like we need to allow our nervous system, our bodies to be open to that level of joy, to that level of love, to that level of wealth. And we need to train ourselves to be able to expand our capacity, as we were saying. So I think it's all like full circle, and we go back to the beginning. We're placing these limits on ourselves because we don't feel safe enough to go outside of those limits. So the whole game is, okay, how can we expand those limits in a way that feels safe for our nervous system and our bodies?
Absolutely. It's about this, exactly what you say, allowing yourself to expand that capacity. And there's a theory called the polyvagal theory, which I won't go into like the whole depth of it, but talking about your like window of tolerance of like what you will, like where you are when you're feeling like present, curious, like you're able to meet challenges. It doesn't mean you're necessarily like at a baseline like calm, but you go up, you can deal with the stress that you're faced with. And people with trauma will have a smaller window of tolerance. Something that might be, seemingly not a big deal to someone who is secure, someone who is regulated in that moment, can send someone who's had trauma or someone who's had some negative experiences right out of that window of tolerance. A lot of the work that I do with my clients when we're working with the unconscious mind and the nervous system is about expanding that window of tolerance so you can actually allow yourself to have more. So you can actually allow to have more spectrum of the human experience without going into a dysregulated state. Because as you said, like we speak about the unconscious mind and it can seem a little intangible to a lot of people, but it is really your nervous system. Like it's your nervous system's baseline. There are so many things that your nervous system does, like to keep you alive without your conscious awareness. Like it keeps your temperature within a certain range. It will keep your heart rate within a certain range. Like it keeps all of these things happening. And it does the same on that like psychological level as well. Like it keeps you within this like reality that you know. And if you want to experience a new reality, you do have to gently, progressively overload. It's like and again, it's got to be this like gentle expansion. Like think of a rubber band. Like if you pull that out really, really far and you let it go, it's just going to snap right back, might even break. But like if we gently stretch something, it will actually stay at that level. Like it's going to, be enough that it's not going to recoil straight back to where it was. So it's all about nervous system regulation and expansion.
So interesting. Super, super interesting. And this is a nice transition into a topic that I think we're both very passionate about, which is neuroscience. I know you love this topic, and I'm curious to know if there are, any latest discoveries or things that you've read lately that really blew your mind about the brain, about our nervous system, which were like your latest discoveries and that really blew your mind.
So it's not so much the latest discovery, but there was something I wanted to say, but I think with the conversation we're having, it's probably really good just to speak a little bit more about polyvagal theory in terms of, like, so many people now know about the fight and flight system, that you can feel that energy even with those words, like that sympathetic nervous system overdrive, which is also, your nervous system is supposed to be responsive. It's not supposed to be calm all the time. Like I want my nervous system activated. If a car pulls out in front of me, I want to mobilize and get out the way. I want to be able to face challenges. And then we think about the rest and digest system where you're in that parasympathetic state. But what is relatively recent, and it's still a bit more of a theory because many of these things, like it's hard to prove in terms of evidence-based medicine, but it's getting very recognized. But is this idea of they're not just being that fight and flight, but there's also a shutdown response. So some people will say a freeze response. And what I want to say in terms of this is the freeze response is sort of that fight, flight, freeze. And that's that like rigid response. So think like a deer in the headlights, that frozen sort of stiffness. But then when that system gets overwhelmed, there's another separate part, and that is the dorsal vagal shutdown response. And the reason I want to bring this up now is because if you're in a chronic state of shutdown, if you're in a chronic state of this hypo, so less than arousal, and you just feel this demotivation, like I'm procrastinating, like I can't get myself to do these things, then often that isn't, it's not that you've got a lack of motivation or a lack of discipline. It's that you've been in this like hyper aroused, so overly activated state, and it crashes right down into this shutdown response. And the true shutdown response that happens when someone is at a point where like they really can't take it anymore, like it's basically the deer has been caught by the lion, and it's a final kindness. Like it's your nervous system being like, you don't have to feel anything anymore. Like it's dissociating. It's like you're going numb. You don't have to feel anything. And this is, becoming more and more like in the sort of public sphere, this conversation. But I just think it's so validating to so many people across all walks of life when they realize like, okay, no, I wasn't being lazy, or people think when something's happened to them, well, I should have done something, like I should have moved, I should have done something. But we're now understanding that there's so much more than that. Like trauma is so much more complex than we originally thought. And it, again, is, as you said, stored in the body. So when you've had a habit, or, well, it's not a habit, but you've had when you have learned to protect yourself in that way, to shut down, to go numb, it is going to take time for you to expand your nervous system's capacity to be able to move past that. Like we have to and sometimes people even have to go into that more like anxious state, like that fight and flight response, before they get to baseline. And so whilst that's, not necessarily like a recent, it's relatively recent in terms of psychological theories, but I think the more people that can understand truly what a shutdown response is and have compassion for themselves during that response, like it's just such validating and powerful knowledge.
And it could sound familiar. You can correct me if I'm wrong, of course. could sound a little bit familiar to a burnout, when you've been so aroused for so long and your nervous system has been so hyper for so long, then your body says, okay, no, we're shutting this down. And then you go into full apathy, full depression, full lack of energy, because it's like is this related or is not related?
I think so. Like it's hard to, like, a true shutdown response is like that acute trauma, but there's definitely this chronic sort of this chronic dissociation, this chronic, and one of the hallmarks of burnout, of course, is this lack of purpose. It's this, I just don't like that apathy, that I don't feel any connection to my work anymore. It's this, and that definitely has similarities between this chronic like hypo arousal, so this chronic like under arousal of like not being able to get themselves going, and like you say, because you've been at that top for so long, there's definitely like other aspects, in terms of things like adrenal fatigue and like physical aspects to it, but absolutely similar processes, I believe.
Amazing, amazing. Is there anything else you would like to add to the audience? Anything else you would like to mention that we haven't covered?
I think we've covered all sorts of things. I think it's been a great conversation. Hopefully it's all linked in together quite well.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. We have learned so much, and I'm sure that the Blisstopia community will be devouring this episode because it's so juicy, on perfectionism and self-sabotage and many of these little monsters that sometimes we need to deal with. But as you said, these little monsters are actually trying to protect us. So thank you so much, Steph, for your time, for all of your wisdom. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the show. So where can the listeners find you online? What's the best place to hang out with you?
So the best place to hang out is probably Instagram at this stage. My handle is at Finding Flow State, which I love as well. With your Blisstopia, I feel like Finding Flow State really just like links in beautifully with that, which is probably partly why we connected.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's the best place to find me. I currently offer one-on-one coaching and have some group coaching offerings coming out. And I'm also in the process of making a free nervous system regulation checklist for people to use on the go, whether you need to upregulate or downregulate. Those are the best places to find me. And I'd absolutely love to hear from any listeners who enjoyed the episode. It's always good to have a chat about things you found interesting. So don't be afraid of sending me a DM.
Amazing. So we're going to have the link in the show notes and also the link to your own podcast so that people can find you and keep in touch with you. So now I love finishing the show with a set of rapid fire questions. So we're going to have 3 questions and I'm just going to shoot them and we're going to answer them very quickly with the first thing that comes to mind. So the first one is, when was the last time you felt bliss?
This morning on a trail running downhill, in the beautiful Dandenong Ranges near Melbourne. Yeah.
Oh, so nice. Sounds amazing. Can you think of one idea that fundamentally changed your life?
So it's the idea that you can regulate your own nervous system when you have that connection. Like, effectively regulating your nervous system is really the key to managing stress and also achieving more, having that balance.
Amazing. And the last one, if you could choose one rule that everybody in the world needs to obey, what would that be?
You cannot practice self-awareness without self-compassion, because self-awareness without self-compassion is just giving your inner critic a megaphone.
So the rule would be that everybody needs to be compassionate as they go into self-awareness?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. The rule is, everyone needs to be self-compassionate, because I see so much of this of people blaming themselves when they just need to be kind to themselves.
Yes, yes. And I think you really brought this up many times, not shaming perfectionism, not shaming self-sabotage, not shaming all of this, because all of this is trying to protect us. It's a nervous system doing its job. So how can we gently and compassionately stretch those things little by little with lots of love? So thank you so much, Steph. This has really been a true joy. We have learned so much from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. I will see my listeners on the next episode. And in the meantime, in Blisstopia we trust.